Hello everyone, I'm Natasha Fateh. Well, it has all the hallmarks of a Cold War thriller and with a touch of science fiction. For the next half hour, we're going to explore how one suspected spy balloon led to the takedown of 3 other unidentified objects and sparked a series of questions about Canada's national defense capabilities. It's time to go in depth. The story first unfolded before our very eyes, floating in the skies over Canada and the United States.
When I was briefed on the balloon, I ordered the Pentagon to shoot it down.
They just shot it.
The claim, China had sent the balloon for spying purposes, an allegation the Chinese strongly deny. Since then, 3 other objects have been shot down over North America, including one in Canadian airspace, but by the Americans.
It was a NORAD mission. It was NORAD capabilities.
U.S. President Joe Biden says the 3 objects shot down are not tied to China, but private companies studying the weather or conducting scientific research. And all signs point to these objects being of this planet.
There is no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity with these recent takedowns.
But old questions have reemerged about Canada's military preparedness at a time when familiar tensions are now simmering between the world's 2 biggest economic powers. Now, coming up, we're going to dig deeper into those questions by speaking with a pilot, a NORAD expert, and a security analyst. But first, here's a look at how this whole story unfolded.
We do know that the balloon has violated U.S. airspace and international law, which is unacceptable.
We saw something take off from the jet and knew it was a missile.
And then all of a sudden, you've seen the balloon just go.
And I want to reassure Americans that these objects do not present a military threat to anyone on the ground.
The safety of Canadians is our #1 priority, and that's why I made the decision to shoot down the object.
I thought they had a snowblower out here going. That's what it sounded like. But he said it was the helicopter.
We'll continue to await, with obviously a lot of urgency, what the precise details and analysis of those recovery operations are.
We don't yet know exactly what these 3 objects were, but nothing right now suggests they were related to China's spy balloon program or that they were surveillance vehicles from any other country.
Now, people have reported seeing unexplainable objects in the skies for as long as we've been around. However, it wasn't until recently that the sightings started being documented. Have a look at this footage that was captured by U.S. Navy pilots back in 2015 off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. It shows what the U.S. Department of Defense characterizes as an unidentified aerial phenomena.
Dude, this is going on, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west.
Our first guest was in the same squadron as the Navy pilots who captured that footage. Ryan Graves is a former U.S. lieutenant who served for a decade. He became the first active duty pilot to come forward publicly about regular sightings of unidentified flying objects. He's now chair of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Integration Committee. Lieutenant, thank you so much for making time for us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
So, Lieutenant, you see that footage for the very first time. Take me back to 2015. What goes through your mind? Absolutely.
When we saw that footage, that had not, in fact, been the first time that we had had a problem with unidentified objects. We took that video in 2015 off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, during our workup cycle. And at this time, this particular object was unique to us. We hadn't seen an object that had demonstrated those flight mechanics that visually appeared, as you see here, with that particular shape. What we don't see in this video were the formation of smaller vehicles that were accompanying this object. And those were the objects that we were regularly detecting all the way back to early 2014.
And so at that point, did you have any sense of what they were?
We really didn't. At first, we thought they were just kind of radar blips, and we were cautious. Eventually, we captured them on our AT FLIR, which is the imagery you're showing now, that type of camera. And eventually, we got close enough to see them with our eyes. We almost had a near miss with one of these objects right at the entrance to our working areas as we were traveling almost 300 miles an hour with another aircraft right next to this. So one of these objects zipped in between our aircraft, and it simply looked like a dark gray or black cube inside of a clear sphere.
And in the end, what were they? What were these objects?
We haven't been able to figure it out. What we really had to do is just put these into a safety bucket after we realized that these objects were there. They were not our U.S. military's. We essentially had to avoid them, and occasionally we simply couldn't just because of how many there were, and so we had to cancel training on occasion. And this problem has continued since it was first come to light in 2014 and is still occurring off the East Coast now. With these recent shootdowns, I suspect that as they've lowered their speed gates and are looking a little more broadly into the range of airspeeds that could be out there, they're going to start noticing the type of objects more and more, similar to the ones that we were reporting off the East Coast.
So, Lieutenant, at what stage do you all in the military have to make a call between this is just a blip in the system, this is a nuisance, avoid it, and oh no, this is a threat to national security?
Certainly. I mean, frankly, it never really rose to the level of national security while I was in the Navy. It was simply an oddity that we reported through our aviation safety reporting channels, which really doesn't end up in a proactive investigation. It's simply for data collection. So at the time, there really was no process for us to report these objects in the Navy off their eastern seaboard. And when I got out of the Navy in 2019 and started speaking publicly about this problem, this is one of the things I've been trying to encourage is greater reporting and official procedures all the way down the ranks so that pilots and aviators feel comfortable reporting these objects without any fear or stigma or ridicule.
Talk to me about that. Why is there fear? Why is there stigma?
It's just such a complicated topic. There's so much context that's been built into our culture with media, and it's something that I think ultimately is just a scary concept to think about something that's completely identified. Within the United States, we've traditionally been afforded technological superiority in most of our battles and warfare. And so this is a bit of a change in that. What are these objects? Why don't we know where they come from? How are they operating? And how many more are there? We just don't have those answers yet.
Lieutenant, ultimately, in the past couple of weeks, so much attention has been given to this alleged Chinese spy balloon and these other 3 unidentified objects that have been shot down. And the reaction from the public as well as from politicians has been mixed. What's your reaction to us, first of all, finding out about them and then still not knowing what any of them were here for?
Yeah, welcome to the party. We've been looking into this and we've been struggling to understand what these objects are and why they're here as well. That's why I've started the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon Integration and Outreach Committee. Mouthful, I know. But it's the AIAA is the largest aerospace engineering organization in the world with over 30,000 plus members. We're building an organization and a network within that community to build up the expertise so that we can go out and we can answer some of these questions, because I don't think necessarily the government is hiding these questions. I think this is a mystery and we need to gather more data and do more analysis before we can get to those conclusions.
Okay, it's fascinating stuff. Lieutenant Ryan Graves, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Time that a NORAD operation has downed an aerial object.
NORAD closely scrutinized our airspace, including enhancing our radar to pick up more slow-moving objects.
All those who serve in NORAD for doing everything necessary to keep us safe. Their service is extraordinarily important to all of us.
There are no active tracks today, but the professionals at NORAD will continue to do their important work.
In the last few days, we've heard a lot about NORAD and its role in shooting down these high-altitude objects. But you might be wondering, what exactly is NORAD and how does it operate? NORAD stands for North American Aerospace Defense Command. It's the world's only binational military command and established by Canada and the United States in the midst of the Cold War in 1958. Military personnel from both Canada and the U.S. are assigned to NORAD, and they watch over North American skies using radars along the coastlines with high-level sensors and fighter jets, including Canadian CF-18s. The headquarters for NORAD is located at the Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. There's also an alternate command post in Winnipeg and another base in Anchorage, Alaska. For more, we have now reached Andrea Sharon. She's the director at the Center for Defense and Security Studies and an associate professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba. She's also the co-author of the book NORAD, In Perpetuity and Beyond. Thank you so much for making time for us, Andrea.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, Andrea, it's been a few days, a few weeks actually. All these objects have been down, and we're still no closer really to knowing what any of them actually were or what their purpose was. Why don't we know more?
Well, the last 3 air objects that were shot down in areas of Alaska, Yukon, and Lake Huron that are very difficult to get to. I understand in Yukon, it fell in quite mountainous area and with a lot of snow. And in Lake Huron, the weather conditions have not been helpful to the search. And so it's a matter of not being able to collect a lot of the debris, and we may just have to be patient.
The skeptics amongst us might say, well, it's being intentionally downed, or these objects are being intentionally down there because they don't want, whoever they are, don't want the public to know what these objects actually are. Separate the fact from fiction for us. What's your best understanding about these objects?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of not wanting the public to know. These 3 air objects were not considered a military threat, but the flight path that they had could interfere with other commercial and civilian airlines, and we don't want that kind of a direct connection. And so it was determined that they needed to be shot down, but you need to make sure that you do that so that it won't create collateral damage on the ground. You don't want to do it over big city centers. You don't want to do it where you're going to perhaps damage critical infrastructure. And so I understand why the 3 areas were chosen. And, you know, it comes down to a matter of being able to line up the objects with the right firepower at the time. Lots of calculations go into this, but I think at the end of the day, we don't want these objects raining down on civilian centers.
As we presented in the explainer just before we spoke with you, NORAD is this binational alliance between the United States and Canada. And from a Canadian perspective, it seems that we're outgunned, we're outnumbered, and all 4 of the objects that were shot down by U.S. jets, including the one over Canadian airspace. So I wonder for you, are Canadians in a position where they can protect their own airspace, or are we at the mercy of the Americans?
Well, I would say it's definitely a partnership. The CF-18s, the Canadian fighter interceptors, were also scrambled. It just so happened that in the case of the object in the Yukon, it was the F-22 that happened to be closer. And that is the beauty of NORAD, that we have these agreements whereby you can have Canadian or U.S. aircraft in the other country to preserve sovereignty. However, the Prime Minister and President have to be consulted about activity in their country. But in terms of whether or not we are wholly dependent on the U.S., I would say the U.S. is also dependent on us. Our North Warning System, which is in Alaska, but the majority of it is across Canada's Arctic, is vital to the early warning for the United States. And this partnership, which will celebrate 65 years on May 12th, really is a partnership. We contribute different skills and capabilities, but together, NORAD has the watch for North America writ large.
Okay. Andrea Sharon, thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Was supposed to drift around in Saskatchewan airspace, sending back data on the ozone layer before dropping back to Earth. But another story developed. A story about a rogue balloon that hit the jet stream and took off.
During the summer of 1998, this 25-story high helium-filled balloon drifted away at speeds of 100 kilometers an hour. Canadian CF-18 fighter jet pilots tried to shoot it down off the coast of Newfoundland with 1,000 rounds of ammo. But their barrage of bullets did not burst the balloon. It also evaded attempts by the U.S. and British Air Force over the North Atlantic Ocean. The balloon hovered above Russian airspace before it landed in Finland more than a week after it first got loose. Well, that was then. So let's get back to 2023 and the objects in the sky. We're joined by Jonathan Berkshire Miller. He's a senior fellow and director of Foreign Affairs, National Defense, and National Security at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Jonathan, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be on again.
Jonathan, let's talk about, from your perspective, how the Canadian federal government has managed the alleged spy balloon and the other 3 unidentified objects.
Well, first of all, I mean, this spy balloon traversed through Canadian airspace as well. So I think that's an important point. There were 2 days where this balloon traversed over British Columbia and then made its way down through the United States, through the Midwest, and then was shot down over the Carolinas. So when thinking of any potential response, I think that this needs to be kept into account. The second element is that the United States, unlike the other 3 unidentified objects, has already started collecting debris and is quite convinced that this is a spy craft from the Chinese. So I'm thinking in the response to this, the Canadian side needs to work very closely with the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation and other intelligence services that are analyzing the details and the equipment that are on this craft, and then craft an appropriate response. Part of that will be diplomatic, part of that will be from the security side, but clearly this highlights the partnership with the Americans and the need to understand in great detail what was on this craft, how it may have impacted Canada's security, and tailor a response with the United States.
Would this be a scenario, let's say it is an object of espionage sent by the Chinese government, would this be a scenario where the Canadians are getting caught up in some sort of a game between Washington and Beijing? Or no, this is absolutely a threat to Canadian intelligence as well?
Well, I think it is. I mean, again, we have to see what capabilities were there, whether it's high definition photography, whether it's sensors that could eavesdrop on communications, or potentially between military communications, which would be even more serious. And even some of the previous panelists that were talking about the importance of NORAD, this is a binational agreement. So this is not something that we can just say is a problem between the United States and China. Clearly, this is a challenge to the threat and a threat to North America and the security of North America. So I think we need to tailor a response in that regard.
Let me ask you a broader question, because for many of us, this was the first time we've ever heard of a spy balloon coming from another country. It seems like such basic technology when you think of how people might spy in the 21st century. How prolific is this? How often are aerial objects used for spying internationally?
Yes, and that's an important point, that this is not an isolated incident. And there's been reports, and we'll have to verify some of those reports, that there's been additional balloons in the North American airspace during the Trump administration, for example. But we've also heard a lot of reports that there's been similar incidents in Taiwan, in the skies above Taiwan, in the skies above Japan, and potentially other allies in Europe. So I think that this is a really key element, is that this is not an isolated incident, and we need to work very closely with a lot of those allies, be they in Asia, be they in Europe, to understand exactly their experiences from this. And when it comes to the debris and the type of material that we collect off this, I think that we need to share that quite closely, not just in a Canada-US context, but ideally with the rest of our allies.
Do you think all that information needs to be shared with the public as well?
I think elements of it do, absolutely. I mean, I think that the public interest in this, and of course the public concern about this incident and also the other 3 objects that were shot down, demand some level of transparency. Clearly, there will be some elements that are not able to be released due to national security concerns, but I think as much as possible, it would be in the interests of both Canada and the United States to release.
Okay, we'll see what happens in the days ahead. Jonathan Berkshire Miller, thank you again so much for your time.
Thanks a lot.
And that does it for our in-depth look at the suspected Chinese spy balloon and those 3 mystery objects shot down from the sky. I'm Natasha Fateh. And while we couldn't touch on every single angle, we did hear from people in the United States and in Canada on what they saw floating above their heads, and we're going to leave you now with some of those voices.
It seems so brazen and just so insane to me that anyone would even attempt to just push a balloon over the sky, because to me it was just like, this thing is so visible.
I'm actually kind of currently in the position that I saw it, and it was right about here in the sky where I stand when we saw it floating just above the horizon.
What's exactly on it? Is it just devices to check, I don't know, our airspace, our military movement and everything?
Gosh, it was almost like a moving cloud coming down. And then the smoke was gone and it just started slowly going down but further out towards the ocean.
I was driving home, I saw this plane light in the sky, and right away my reaction was, oh my God, I wonder if that's another thing.
And for safety, and when they do shoot stuff down like that, you don't know, because people do stay out in the communities, out, like trap lines and stuff. You don't know if there's people out in the land.